Okay, so today's lesson is actually 2 in 1. So the first lesson is about, this first part is about shelter versus housing, and the second one is about behavior of animals. So firstly, on the slide, we've got two different pictures. On the one side, we have, well, both of them are types of shelters. You can see on the one side, the area is open, so the animal can come in and out, move freely as it wants to. Maybe go inside for shade if it's a very hot day, or maybe it can walk inside if it's hailing or raining or something. But on the right side, we have more of a permanent housing system where the animals cannot leave when they want to. We can see the feeding bowls on the outside for the cattle, they're being fed and they're kept inside permanently. So the main difference between a shelter and a housing system is that a shelter is there temporarily. So the animals are free to move, they can come in, go out, search for shelter and then go back and graze outside. But for the housing system, usually the animals are kept inside permanently or to a more permanent effect. So the animals can't move when they want to, they can't move freely. The farmer or a labourer must actually physically take them out or open the door and allow them to go outside. So the first thing is there's a different shelter and housing structures. What is the different things depend on? So there are four main things. It depends on whether the farmer uses the shelter option or a housing structure, a physical house and so on. So the first thing that determines this is the type of farming system. So again, this goes back to the previous lesson where we talked about extensive and intensive farming. So intensive, mainly you've got a lot of animals. Most of them have to be kept indoors, whereas your extensive system, you can allow them to walk outside. So something for extensive would be nice to use a shelter because it's just for shade or if the animals have to quickly cover for hail. Whereas your housing system, that will have to be used with your intensive farming system. Then secondly, the type of animal, and with a type here I want to emphasize the size of the animal. So the size will definitely determine, do you need a big housing structure or can you make a small shelter for them, temporary shelter. Thirdly, the size of the herd as well. So this refers to the numbers of animals. Do you need a small shelter, a big shelter? What's going to be based for the size or the amount of animals you have? Then lastly is the weather conditions. So again, is it an area that's usually sunny, then the animals only kind of need a temporary shelter again from the sun, shade. But if the weather is generally bad and you need to, or the farmer needs to control the environment and make sure that it's not too hot, not too cold, and they want to boost production, then a housing structure will probably be the best. So these four main things, please remember, is what depends on whether you use a shelter or a housing structure. Then this second half of the slide, importance of shelter and housing. Why do we actually need to worry about this? So we talked about the first one, protection against weather and climate. That's the obvious thing. The animals need to be able to avoid being hit by hail. But the second thing as well, they need to be protected against predation. So many times keeping them inside a structure is good for their protection or their benefit. Then thirdly, also to protect them against any theft. So usually if you have the animals behind lock and key, it'll be more difficult for a thief to actually come and steal them. Then fourthly, controlled environment for optimal production. So meaning you want to again control the temperature, maybe the ventilation, everything that goes on the inside of this building so that you can increase the production of these animals, meaning the amount of wool they make, the meat they make, or the amount of eggs a chicken lays. So it's all to increase the production. Then lastly, it's usually a space for management activities as well. So meaning you have, let's take the example there in parentheses of shearing and milking. You have a milking parlor or you allow your cows to stand or to come into your housing structure every day, and now it's a physical space that allows you to actually milk your cows. All your equipment and machinery and everything you need is in this building. Same thing with shearing of sheep. So when they come into this area, now there is space and also all the tools and everything you need to actually shear the animals. Okay, then we look at different types of intensive production systems. So this is just for intensive, not extensive. The first intensive one you actually get is semi-intensive. So in this case, as we can see in the picture, there is a chicken coop, and I'm using here the example of chickens for the other examples as well, just to compare them more easily. So you can see the chickens are allowed to roam freely outside, but they are still enclosed for protection against predators. So we do see a giant fence It's also closed at the top, so the chickens can't get out, and foxes and things that want to come inside, jackals and so on, they can't climb into this building or into the fence. So this is all there to still protect them, but animals are still allowed to move around and eat what they want to. So kind of in a way they are free range, meaning they can move around, but still they are protected. So this is what we call semi-intensive. Okay, the second example is the backyard or the actual free-range system. So in this case, as the picture shows, the animals, the chickens, are allowed to walk around wherever they want to. Far behind in the distance in the picture, there is a fence, so the animals are limited still to where they are allowed to move. It's not like a farm that is very, very big or extensive example. So it's still intensive, it's a small area, but it's big enough for the animals to move around where they want to, eat what they want to, and usually there's no protection from predators or thieves. So there's no going to be any shelter, no chicken coop, the animals are just allowed to move around. But because it's still intensive farming, there will probably be a manager or a farm worker checking up on the animals now and again to make sure they're there and count them and so on. But again, the animals are allowed to roam freely. And the third type is intensive system. So an example of an intensive production system is the intensive system. So this is usually what we think about when we think about intensive. So on the one side we see some cows, in the middle we see pigs and pig cubicles, and the last one is chickens. So in this case, animals are prevented from roaming around. Usually they don't see the outside. We can see in the pictures that there is some lighting, natural lighting coming inside, but they don't need felt. They don't go roam outside in anything. They just confined to their housing system, and that's where they stay forever. So this is your extremely intensive system, I want to say. So they're permanently in a housing area. So then we have different types of examples of intensive systems. So the first one is known as a holding shed, and here important into parentheses what they say temporary. So usually a holding shed is literally used to keep animals in a shed for a small amount of time. So usually it's something like during the day, the animals are brought inside to eat maybe, but they can go outside after a while. So they're just kept inside for, let's say, a day or two, or maybe it's a week. If the animals used to be outside, they're brought inside into the shed, and then they're kept there for fattening, to fatten them, and before they go to the feedlot. So it depends on what needs to happen. So they just kept there temporarily, usually longer than a couple of hours, so let's say a day at least, or maybe a week at the most. Then secondly, a holding pen. This is just used to quickly sort animals. So a holding pen is something that you use if maybe you bought animals, the truck unloads them, they go into the pen, you quickly just want to sort them out. Which ones maybe do you want to use for breeding, which ones should go into this camp or that camp. So they're usually in a holding pen for a couple of hours max. They don't stay there, they usually don't eat there. Then thirdly, you've got your feeding shed. So here's the example of the cows to the right. They stand on the inside in this building and they are fed their rations in this area. So it's a place where they can eat, get all the nutrients they need. Most of the time, usually they will get water as well. And with a feeding shed, they can either stay here permanently, like in the intensive system, or they could be allowed to go out now and again to the veld. Then lastly, the last example is the farrowing pen, and here it just refers to pigs specifically. So this is the picture at the left-hand side. So the farrowing pen's purpose is to keep the sow, the female pig, from actually rolling around too much and squashing her piglets. Unfortunately, this does happen. So they can't feel where the piglets are, and then sometimes they actually hurt them. So the farrowing pen is to allow the pig to actually give birth as well. So the word farrow or farrowing refers to giving birth. And then the piglets are allowed to suckle on the mother without the mother hurting them. Okay, so then there are different factors affecting housing requirements. These are three main ones: temperature, ventilation, and stocking density. So with temperature, that a farmer needs to keep in mind when making a housing structure is that usually your long, narrow buildings can be kept cooler in summer and warmer in winter. So the shape is actually very important to help the farmer or a manager to manipulate what the temperature is going to be inside the building. So then you don't have to spend so much money on cooling systems or heating systems. So just by having the right shape of building will also help the temperature. Then ventilation. Ventilation is very, very important. Fresh air has to come into a building, especially where animals are, because it removes any ammonia smells, bad smells, dust, and also bacteria, because remember, bacteria can cause diseases. And also this helps with temperature control. So many times we want an open window somewhere to bring in a fresh breeze with a cool air. Then lastly, stocking density refers to the amount of animals we find in a particular area. So something to remember here, if there is not enough animals in your building, the farmer will have a low profitability. So meaning he won't make enough money because he's wasting space that he could have actually used to allow more animals to stay inside. And you could have fed more animals. But then again, if he allows too much animals to stay on the inside, the bottom there, it can decrease growth rate, the growth rate of different animals, especially if, let's say, they compete for food, so some of them won't get enough food, so this causes some of them to stop growing or to grow slower. And then also it can cause abnormal behavior, especially if there are too many animals in the same space, than in each other's space, and the one can't get to the food source, maybe the food bowl or wherever it is. Sometimes, depending on the animal, the type of animal, they can actually resort to cannibalism, so they can actually start to eat each other. This usually can happen with chickens, really, well, sometimes I think it can happen to pigs, depends on the species of animal, but it just generally goes to abnormal behavior. So even if they don't start eating one another, they will definitely fight because they're competing for food. Then also some equipment and tools needed for intensive systems. So these things are actually quite obvious, but just to list a few things, like we see here in this giant intensive system for the chickens, they have feeders hanging there from the pipes, and also they have water dripping systems. So drippers for the water and also feeders for the feed. Then most of these cases, some of the things that's needed is bedding, because again the animals have to be able to lie on a soft area, otherwise they get hurt. And also many times the bedding is something like shavings that can also absorb moisture and bad smells. Then also the farmer or the manager has to think about artificial lighting, because the animals will have to have light during the day, especially if they're indoors. A wheelbarrow will be important, brooms, buckets and so on for cleaning purposes. And lastly, there should be a heating and cooling system if the temperature must be regulated. Okay, so lastly, the behavior of farm animals. So we're looking here at cattle first. So they represent our big ruminants. So usually why a farmer has to know the behavior of animals is so that they can better handle them, and also so they can recognize that something is wrong with the animal. So the first thing to remember about cows is that they have poor depth perception. So they can't really see what's in front of them, and they can't judge how far away it is. Secondly, they've got sensitive hearing, so people handling cattle must actually be sensitive to them and not make loud noises, which is ironic because we do use whips to actually move them along. Then thirdly, when they are ruminating, they like to lie down. This is important, so the farmer will allow the animal to have enough space. If they're kept inside a housing system, they must have space to lie down and ruminate. And then lastly, they have herd mentality, meaning they need to be with others. And it's very difficult to actually herd one single cow. Usually they must be herded with other individuals with them. Okay, so this slide actually is very, very important. So this can be applied to most of your large ruminants, so not just cows, but usually this example uses cows. So we see here what's important is that the animal has an edge of, well, it has a flight zone. So this is the edge of the flight zone, and this area is where anything that is closer than this radius will cause the animal to flee, because they also have a personal space bubble, not with each other, but usually with predators and humans. So come anywhere closer, they will bolt and run away. So this is the flight zone. Then also right behind them, they can't see anything. So this is called their blind spot. So meaning they can startle very easily if one approaches them from the blind spot and all of a sudden appear to the side. So this will definitely be a bad idea with cows. Then also they've got a point of balance. The point of balance here refers to the shoulder. So if one were to stand right here, this will actually cause the cow to stop, because they don't really know what you want to do. But In the event that you move more forward, and especially closer, but forward above, in front of the point of balance, this will stop the cow, because in essence you're kind of standing in front of the cow's face and they think they can't move forward, so then they stop. Whereas if you're behind the point of balance, they kind of think that you're chasing them, and then they will move forward. So the point of balance basically is there to manipulate the movement of the animal. So just want to show here as well, they talk about the handle position to stop movement. So again, if you're also outside of the flight zone and behind the point of balance, you can stop an animal from moving. But if you are inside the flight zone and also still behind the point of balance, this will actually cause the animal to move forward, because you're way too close for comfort for this animal, plus you're behind it, not in front of it, so it will move forward. Okay, so this diagram I actually love asking you guys in the exams. So this diagram is a good one to remember. So the main thing they usually ask is the blind spot, which is behind the animal, and the point of balance, which can help you move the animal or stop the animal, which is just over the shoulder. Okay, then the behavior of sheep, and they represent small ruminants. So usually sheep, they have a large or a wide visual field. They see very well and very far. Because they're prey animals, they need to see predators coming from a mile away. Then secondly, they also have a hierarchy or a pecking order, like we usually say for chickens. So you have your dominant sheep and your not so dominant sheep. So usually when they are being herded, if one of them bolts and is the dominant sheep, all of them will bolt afterwards or run along with this sheep. So the idea is to figure out who the dominant sheep is, get this one to go a certain way, and then the rest will follow it. Then thirdly, ewes usually lamb away from the flock. So this is important for a farmer to know, because we're in the lambing season. The farmer has to ensure that there is enough space then, or if it's in the veld or somewhere, that the ewe will be able to leave the flock and then go lamb in a safe area. Usually in intensive housing system, this is not so much of an issue, but what must happen is that the sheep must be separated from one another. Usually they use cubicles to separate them, because they do not want to be inside the flock or a part of the flock when they lamb. They want to be on their own. Then lastly, they're also highly social, meaning they will move in the flock. So again, don't try and separate them. They will try and run after one another. Then the behavior of pigs, they represent the non-ruminants. So usually their behavior is when they're relaxed, they're lying on their stomachs, on their sides. So literally when they're lying down, it means they're relaxed and they're fine. Secondly, they can't handle intense heat very well. So usually intense heat exposure for very long times can cause the death of these animals. But generally this just means if the animal can get heat stress very easily. So then you can't do anything with it, and if they stress or if they've got too much intense heat on them and their bodies overheat, they will lose weight and eventually they'll stop growing. So then also they've got poor vision. So this is important to know when you're trying to handle the animals. They won't necessarily see you coming, and they obviously don't have depth perception. But in essence, they do have a good sense of smell and hearing. So they will be able to hear you coming and definitely smell you or smell the food they want to eat. Then all the time, I think most people know this, animals, they are very unpredictable to handle and very difficult to catch. So they must be kept as calm as possible. And lastly, they're actually very clean animals, and this does not refer to their skin, because they do roll in mud, so physically they are unclean. But the clean here means they are very tidy. So usually when they have an enclosure, they will defecate in one area, urinate in one area, sleep in another, and eat in another. So they don't mix their spots. So in parentheses also says there specific spots for defecation. Okay, then the behavior of farm animals, in this case chickens or poultry. Like we just mentioned, they do have a pecking order, so you do have dominant hens and less dominant ones, and usually the dominant hens lay more eggs, just for the reason it usually gets more feed. Then secondly, high temperature causes chicks to breathe rapidly with their open mouths. It's a quick sign to tell the farmer that these chicks or the chickens, they have a little bit of heat stress, so they will have to have shade or some water to drink. And then also low temperatures cause chicks to huddle together, so that's a clear sign that the animals are too cold. Then also they've got actually very good eyesight. So many times they chase moving insects. So as soon as a cricket or something moves, they will pounce because their eyes are very good and they know exactly where it is. And lastly, pacing can occur when hens have no nests to lay eggs. So all chickens want a nest. Sometimes they try and build them, but it depends on what their circumstances are. I mean, if they're in a housing system and it's planks everywhere and no feathers or no bedding or anything, they will become anxious and start pacing because they actually need to lay their eggs in a soft, warm area. So there's a clear sign for the farmer to do something about it. And lastly, factors affecting animal behavior. So usually transportation causes stress of animals, and again, a stressed animal is an unpredictable animal. That's important to remember. Again, a fearful one as well. So when they are in fear, they will be attacked by another animal, or when they are attacked by another animal, they will be fearful and unpredictable. Then also pain can cause unpredictability, and the examples are here: mastitis or other diseases can cause discomfort and pain. Mastitis we will talk about later when we talk about diseases, but basically it's when the udder of a cow is swollen and there's an infection of bacteria. Then also when they want to protect their young or their territory, and any loud noises like we've mentioned whips can cause them to be unpredictable. And lastly, movement that they suddenly see in their blind spot. So again, never approach an animal from behind, especially not a large one that cannot see behind it. And that is it. Thank you very much.